In the summer of 1520, the Spanish conquest of Mexico nearly ended in utter disaster. Up to that point, Hernán Cortés had achieved the impossible, entering Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, and subduing Emperor Moctezuma II without a major battle. However, the Aztecs watched with growing hatred the foreigners occupying their sacred city. The massacre at the Templo Mayor, the death of Moctezuma, and the general uprising changed the situation irreversibly. On the night of June 30th, the Spanish attempted to flee Tenochtitlan in silence. What followed became known as the Night of Sorrows. Discovered during their retreat, they were attacked. Dozens of soldiers drowned under the weight of their armor and the gold they carried. The Spanish allies, the Tlaxcalans, were mercilessly massacred. When dawn broke, the invading army was shattered. They had lost more than half their men, almost all their artillery, a large portion of their horses, and morale was at rock bottom. Cortés made a desperate decision to flee toward Tlaxcala, an allied territory, knowing that the Mexica would relentlessly pursue them. For days, the Spaniards, harassed by their enemies, advanced eastward, hoping to reach Tlaxcala. On July 7, 1520, near the town of OTUMBA, their escape came to an end. Blocking the way was an immense Mexica army. Retreat was no longer possible. Their only option was to die fighting. Facing them were between 10,000 and 20,000 warriors. The Triple Alliance, composed of Tenochtitlan and the neighboring cities of Texcoco and Tacuba, had gathered all its forces to definitively end the Spanish presence. Command was held by the Xiuhcoatl Matlatzincatl, high priest and prime minister, who was the most powerful person after the Aztec emperor. Armed with clubs, spears, darts, and shields, and protected by padded cotton armor, they were grouped under brightly colored banners. In the front lines were the elite, the jaguar and eagle warriors, with costumes that imitated these predators. They did not seek only to kill, they wanted to capture prisoners to sacrifice to their gods. The Spanish army numbered barely 400 soldiers, many of them wounded, disarmed, or exhausted after days of marching without rest. They were accompanied by several hundred Tlaxcalan warriors, also weakened by the retreat. They had only a few functional arquebuses and a small number of crossbows and some mastiffs. The pikemen positioned themselves behind the swordsmen, while the crossbowmen formed up to cover their comrades. The Tlaxcalans positioned themselves on the left flank. Cortés gathered his approximately 20 horsemen, who, despite their small number, remained the most feared weapon of the Mexica. At a signal from Matlatzincatl, thousands of Mexica charged Cortés's men to the beat of their drums. Shortly before the battle began, the Spanish horsemen charged into the approaching crowd. This maneuver caught their enemies by surprise, and the Spanish were able to penetrate deep into the disorganized Aztec ranks, crushing and killing every enemy they encountered. By the time the Mexica could react, the horsemen had already turned and withdrawn from the fight. This charge allowed the infantry to prepare for defense. Crossbows and arquebuses unleashed their projectiles upon the mass of indigenous warriors, killing many. The cotton armor proved ineffective against Spanish technology, but despite the losses, the Mexica responded with their bows and darts, managing to wound some enemies. Soon, both armies engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The furious Aztec charge was halted by Spanish shields and pikes. The Mexica struck the Spaniards, attempting to stun them and drag them out of formation to capture them. However, the Spaniards mercilessly cut down their opponents with swords and lances. Meanwhile, Cortés and the rest of the cavalry charged again against the Aztecs, sowing panic and death in their wake. They would then retreat and, after a brief rest, charge once more. This allowed the Spanish infantry to face fewer enemies who were forced to fight the cavalry. However, the numerical difference was overwhelming, and the Spanish were gradually falling. Furthermore, on the flank defended by the Tlaxcalans, who had no technological advantage, and despite fighting fiercely, they were on the verge of defeat. After hours of fighting, the Spanish began to be surrounded. The horses continued to be the greatest psychological factor. Each Spanish charge opened temporary gaps in the Mexica ranks. The warriors retreated, not out of cowardice, but because they had never before fought against such a force. But the horses were becoming fewer and fewer, and the riders were exhausted. Cortés understood that they could not win by attrition. They needed a decisive blow. In the midst of the battle, Cortés observed something crucial. The Mexica army was not acting chaotically. All the orders seemed to come from a hill, where a large banner waved, surrounded by elite warriors. There stood Matlatzincatl. Cortés understood that if that leader fell, the army would lose coordination. Cortés launched a charge toward that point, followed by other horsemen. The Aztecs, after hours of fighting, were somewhat fragmented and scattered, and surprised by this desperate move, they were unable to halt their advance. By the time they realized Cortés's intentions, the horsemen had already reached the hill where their leader was located. The Spaniards attacked the Aztecs with the fury born of desperation, killing all who opposed them. Juan de Salamanca rushed at the Chihuahuatl Matlatzincatl, and striking him down with a lance, seized the standard. When the warriors of the Triple Alliance saw the Castilian horsemen raise their general's banner, they considered the battle lost. Mesoamerican tradition stipulated that the death of their commander meant the end of the fight. The Spaniards, incredulous, watched as the enemy began to retreat. Many Aztec warriors believed the gods had abandoned them, and what seemed like a sure victory turned into confusion and retreat. The Spaniards and Tlaxcalans launched a pursuit, and the infantry, which until moments before had been on the verge of annihilation, now massacred their enemies without mercy as they tried to flee. Against all logic, the Spanish army had won. It was not a clean or glorious victory. It was a desperate one. The Battle of OTUMBA was not the largest or the bloodiest battle of the Spanish conquest of Central America, but it was one of the most decisive. He saved the Spanish expedition from total destruction, and that day marked the beginning of the end for the Aztec Empire. The defeat was a devastating blow from which they never recovered. The Spanish victory had a profound impact on the fate of the Mexica Empire. After surviving against all odds, Hernán Cortés's forces managed to reach Tlaxcala, regroup, and maintain their alliance with the Tlaxcalans. This allowed the Spanish to rebuild their army, prepare a new campaign, and return a year later to besiege Tenochtitlan, whose fall in 1521 marked the end of the Aztec Empire.